Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, the United States emerges from the diplomatic deep freeze, announcing a bold new 2030 climate target. Fresh questions emerge about policing and domestic violence interventions after the horrific deaths of a young mother and a 9-month-old baby girl. And we'll ask why teaching consent seems to be so fraught and why these conversations should be milkshake-free zones. Joining me on our high-octane Friday night panel, author and broadcaster Yumi Stynes. Finally, we have you here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Drag performer Courtney Act, you splendid creature, thank you for joining us. In Melbourne, Senior Fellow at the University of Melbourne School of Government and former Victorian Liberal MP John Pesutto. John, welcome.
G'day, Julia.
And in Adelaide, journalist Tory Shepherd is back again. Always good to see you, Tors.
Chuffed to be here.
If you want to join in on Twitter, you just have to use the hashtag The Drum, and we are also on Facebook. So the US is back, baby. That was the message President Joe Biden brought to his much-lauded virtual Earth Summit, pledging to dramatically reduce his nation's carbon emissions by 2030.
The United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade. That's where we're headed as a nation. And that's what we can do if we take action to build an economy that's not only more prosperous, but healthier, fair, and cleaner for the entire planet. You know, these steps will set America on a path of net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050.
Ahead of this meeting, the United States made it clear they were expecting Australia to also up the ante on its commitments. But last night, Scott Morrison stuck to his mantra that technology trumps targets.
For Australia, it is not a question of if or even by when for net zero, but importantly, how. That is why we're investing in priority new technology solutions through our Technology Investment Roadmap initiative.
So after last night, here is the lay of the land in terms of refreshed pledges by the world's big polluters. The UK is a standout performer, pledging to reduce emissions by 62% on 2005 levels by 2030. Others have made similarly large commitments, but Australia sits close to the back of the queue, pledging to reduce emissions by 28%. Amidst the criticism of Australia's position, today the Prime Minister offered up another one, $100 million for so-called blue carbon initiatives. What is blue carbon, I hear you ask, and where can we find it? Right here, below the surface of our coastal waters, in the mangroves, tidal marshes and seagrass forests, all of which act as vast carbon sinks.
Australian seagrass, mangrove and salt marshes absorb 20 million tonnes of carbon dioxide each year, which remains locked up in their soils for millennia. Now that's about the same as the annual emissions of more than 4 million vehicles. These mangroves environments are often referred to the lungs of the ocean. Some may even call them the liver of the ocean and the cleansing impact that they have.
John Pesutto, is technology enough without a target?
Well, it may or may not be, but I think it's been a positive week overall for the climate debate in Australia, I would argue, even if there are people who would want the government to be going further with targets. I think some of the key things the government's announced this week suggest to me there's been major shifts, which we've been seeing over recent weeks. The government not always trumpeting the changes, but definitely moving in that direction. You had the hydrogen announcement, the carbon capture and storage announcement yesterday, apart from the blue carbon announcements today. And interestingly this week, I think the government's also been signalling that there'll be changes not only potentially on the 2050 front, but also on the Paris targets for 2030. And whilst it's not giving any clear indication of what the specific targets in each of those cases might be, certainly what I'm reading into that is that there'll be an upwardly revised target before Glasgow later this year. There is, of course, I think it's fair to say, Julia, a lot of international pressure for targets, and the government may have to move on that in the coming weeks and months. I suspect they may do that. But I think we shouldn't lose sight also of just making sure when we're looking at those comparisons that we understand in each jurisdiction what the carve-outs are. I'm not cavilling at all with the general moves, which I support in terms of strong climate action. But I would want to, before racing to judgment on international comparisons, for example, the US commitment to 50% by 2030. That's an enormous amount. And I hope they can achieve it for their sake.
Yes.
But I'd be interested to know what the carve-outs would be, and there'll have to be some, I suspect.
The Biden administration is saying it's about the approach. And I think one of their officials said the differences are largely about what the trajectory is and how you get there. One view of the world says, don't worry, technology will solve the problem. The other view of the world says, at the end of the day, technology will contribute, but is insufficient on its own to solve the problem. You have to have a set of policies. You have to have national intent. You have to follow up with actions and commitments. I mean, I think the problem, John, is don't we globally have a history of saying we will reach targets by technology dreamed up, but not yet functional, like carbon capture?
Yeah, look, I think Australia internationally might be a little unfairly maligned for this reason. When you look at some of the indicators on rooftop solar, when you look at the deployment of renewable investments, we're actually doing rather well. And that's not to say there aren't other challenges, and I want those challenges met, let me tell you. But I think in terms of Australia, let's remember we do have a 2030 target. I suspect that will be revised. That seems to be the messaging coming out of the government, certainly this week. And as for a 2050 target, I think, again, the messaging seems to be that in response to international pressure, that's highly likely that we'll see a target by the end of the year. But that's just a prediction I'm making, Julia.
Tory, we're talking here about, John's talking about, trying to read the signals, read between the lines, understand the language, the positioning. Scott Morrison is talking to a number of different people all at the same time, sending out kind of a range of messages. Is it your interpretation that we're going to have targets with respect to 2050 at least?
I don't know. It's sort of like a Rorschach test, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit tedious. You get the magnifying glass out and use words like inching and edging and maybe pivoting, but we don't have targets. Yeah. Glacial. And then you see things like how we are doing well, as John said, in terms of solar rooftop and so on and so forth, which actually the markets are doing and individuals are doing and the states are setting targets and big corporations are setting their own targets. And I think what they'd really like is to know what the federal government's target's going to be for certainty. And then I think a lot of the other countries would like to know what that's going to be in terms of, are we on board with this very global movement that's happening? And I also think our neighbours in the Pacific would really like to know that we are deeply committed to making these changes. And I think what's lacking in all of it is the sense of urgency and this slight magical thinking around technology, as though something is going to come out that's going to solve it all without us actually aggressively pursuing those targets through policies designed to do just that.
Well, let's talk to someone who has done a lot of thinking around the policies and targets and technology. For more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by Executive Director of Climate Works Australia. This is a non-profit group which develops projects to reduce carbon emissions. Anna Scarbeck, welcome to The Drum.
Hello.
Now, pledges like this from the US, which we've just been talking about, sound huge, a 50% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. What will this actually mean in the day-to-day lives of Americans?
Great question. And we've studied all of the technologies that are available in Australia. They're quite similar in America. And we look at them across the major sectors that produce emissions. And there are technologies now that produce zero emission solutions in electricity, buildings, transport, industry, and food, land and oceans, which are the sectors where we need to remove the emissions from the way we live our lives and operate our economies. We know that the technology can do this, provided that we use the technology and replace the older versions that produce fossil fuel emissions or other greenhouse gases. So what does it look like? For many homes and businesses, many already are with the use of renewable energy, but we've got to do it in a much more widespread way so that all equipment that produces, that uses fossil fuels, so whether that's in manufacturing, whether that's gas that's being used, that we need to convert all of that to either a clean electricity, renewable electricity version, or for longer versions of transport where, for example, batteries would work in smaller vehicles but not in trucks and planes, we can use what's called fuel cells, so where you can use hydrogen fuel cells, or even for aviation, for very long haul, it's likely to be sustainable biofuels. In other solutions we've seen, of course, is the nature-based solutions. So integrating it with farming has wonderful mutual benefits for improved food productivity and soil health and water retention in a dry country like Australia. similarly for many parts of America, as well as sequestering carbon through the forests and the soils. So from an economic perspective, it's predominantly focused on upgrading the equipment, modernising the sectors particularly that use this industrial and residential and commercial forms of energy and other economic activities. But for many of us going about our lives, we can still have a healthy and prosperous Australia with mining and manufacturing and retail and hospitality and the homes and cars that we're used to, provided we ensure that they are zero emissions versions of that. So it does mean a big effort in upgrading all of that equipment. And generally we find thinking about the economy in a more sustainable way produces other benefits as well. The cleaner air, cleaner waters, safer soils and food production,
sure.
Alongside more efficient use of technology, what digitisation can do for us, and the circular economy about using resources, natural resources, more efficiently.
Right. So this is many things that we hope we can do, and we hope we can put into place. When you look at the list of of all the targets, do you feel confident that those countries can meet them? The Prime Minister has repeatedly made the point that these are promises and that promises can be broken. Does he have a point?
We are confident that these targets can be met. Our analysis with worldwide alliances showed this before the Paris Agreement was agreed. Indeed, the governments wanted that confidence before the Paris Agreement was even agreed over 5 years ago. What we know, though, is that technology improves its performance and its cost the more that we use it. And so a great part of the solution is in the rollout, is in ensuring that deployment can be large scale. And that's when we've seen it in rooftop solar, we're seeing it now in batteries, plummeting costs. The more that we use and develop these technologies, the more opportunities we have to improve the way we deliver them. So there is ample analysis that shows that in all of the sectors, the technologies have the potential to reduce our emissions to net zero or very near zero. But the key is using those technologies at scale fast enough to enable it to avoid those future emissions that will make the climate so much more dangerous.
So what would we need to do right now to get to net zero by 2050?
Start the upgrade in every sector. So set as the new normal that whenever we are purchasing any equipment or any supply chain, whether it's food, buildings, industry, transport, any purchase decision is your default, the zero emissions option. And in many of those sectors, there is already a mature option available, but it's not the first thing that comes to people's minds. So policy can help that. We can make it mandatory to use a certain percentage of fuels that are cleaner, or to meet a certain energy efficiency standard for buildings and homes. You can do it through regulation. You can set a price incentive, which has been discussed and tried for years, but does work, we know, for many sectors. For other sectors, sometimes the products are still in what we call early stage, and that requires the sector leaders and participants to come together and say, we know it's early stage and it might still have those early stage costs involved in using this for the first time. But we know it makes it safer for us all that we can move to that. So being the first buyer, so governments can use their procurement power, governments can regulate, governments can incentivise. There are a range of ways to skin the cat, but the goal is to get the technology into widespread usage in all of the sectors that produce emissions.
Would it not be a lot easier to do if we had a national pricing mechanism? You've said that's one option, but how key is that as an option?
We know that it works. It did work when it was in operation in Australia, and it is an incentive that works for nearly all sectors. There are some sectors that still need more than a price signal. But
how important is that? How important is it?
It's very important, and it really does make a difference.
Let me bring
in the meantime, there are other ways that essentially governments choose regulation when they've chosen not to use pricing. We're finding that's what we're seeing.
Right. Courtney, so Anna spoke in there about some of the things that we might need to do if we're going to move towards reduction in carbon emissions or net zero by 2050. Do you think Australians are ready to accept some of the changes? Could we even have a national pricing mechanism again after what happened last time?
I think Australians don't have a choice in whether they're ready to accept it or not, because you can't have that short-term gratification mindset, because this is something that's very real. We're looking at 50-degree days in Australia within the next couple of decades. That means we have to change our whole way of life. We won't be able to go outside the house between 3 and 5 o'clock because it's going to be so hot. We're going to have to restructure how our whole society works if we're not going to take action seriously on this. So it's kind of like buy now, pay later. Like you've got to take action whether you like it or not.
John, do you think Australians would be ready for that?
Oh, they're ready for change, but I think the nature of the debate as it's evolving, certainly over recent months, is more on that question of how we transition, and not just through technology, but how over time. And you know, a lot of the dynamics that both the Prime Minister and I imagine, you know, Anthony Albanese leading the Labor Party are trying to manage that so that communities can be brought along on this journey to net zero. And, you know, the fact is, which is pretty hard to circumvent, that I understand all the arguments around a national pricing mechanism, but we're kind of confronted with the historical fact that at the last 4 elections, both Liberal and Labor governments have won elections precisely not to do that, remember, from 2010. So the appetite the nation has for a pricing mechanism just doesn't seem to be there. And that's why, you know, more efforts, more sustained efforts at, you know, lowering emissions, some of the announcements we've seen this week forming part of that, are going to be the key here. Let's remember also the Prime Minister, in fairness to him, is not necessarily against a target in as much as this can be said, that he's saying that he supports getting to net zero as soon as possible. And let's be hopeful that that's before 2050.
Depends what as soon as possible means.
It doesn't mean soon. Come on, John. Stop making things up.
Yeah, I'm interested in Yumi's view on this, because I know this is something you really care about. At the same time, you know, we have seen it be this politically fraught thing. We're seeing politicians dance around it. They won't use certain words. It can't be about green. It can be about jobs. It can't be about inner city cafes. Oops, all of a sudden, it can be about the regions. What do you make of that kind of realpolitik talk when there is such an urgency to just get something done?
Yeah, well, it shits me to tears. People like me are kind of given responsibility as CEOs of our households, as people who are quite active at work, to agitate for, let's recycle this. Can we have shorter showers? Are we eating less meat today? But those changes, while they're well-intentioned and they are, you know, great, they're not going to do anything on the big scale. And what we need really is federal leadership to take charge here. And it feels like they're running a campaign based on the fact that it is hideous to confront what is ahead of us if we don't act. So a lot of us just want to bury our heads in the sand and say it's not happening.
It's interesting because so much of the polling shows that a majority of the country wants something to be done and is concerned about it. And yet we have this gap between voting behaviour as well.
I think a lot of it's about fear about having to pay more for anything, fear about losing some of your privileges to go and buy big flat screen TVs every couple of years, and fear of actually acknowledging that the seas might rise and the air might get hotter.
Tory, the government spoke today about blue carbon. They've invested money in this before. There's an additional $100 million today. These are real, tangible investments, aren't they? Even though there's been some controversy about marine parks.
Look, there are tangible ways forward on a whole range of technologies, but you need the pressure to make them happen, to get the uptake happening. And that takes something like a target, and preferably something like a carbon price. But, you know, that well has been so thoroughly poisoned, I can't see anyone ever bringing it up again. And I'm with Yumi, it shits me to tears. I can't believe we're facing such a global catastrophe and it gets mired down in this really petty politics, like concern about a backbencher crossing the floor or, you know, a Queensland senator losing his spot. It's really, you know, I shudder to think how people will look back on the politicking that has happened around climate change. And look, of course, all investment is welcome in all technologies. except maybe ones that have already pretty much been debunked, like carbon capture and storage, maybe not so good. All of that is welcome, but it feels like pussyfooting around the edges, and it lacks, again, the urgency that the situation requires.
Anna, what did you make of the blue carbon announcement today? What can $100 million do?
It all helps. And what solutions can do when they're brought to life is show everyone, if they're visible enough, that there are multiple benefits of doing this, as well as all the urgent reasons and the duty and the necessity of doing it, and the risk of not doing it. It is exactly what's needed to get early stage markets going. So something like a $100 million program allows proposals that are almost ready to go to get up with a little bit of early support while others don't understand them so well, and then they can understand the risks and see that in fact the risks can be quite well managed, and then it's a lower cost for the next round. What's really important though is that when grants appear like this and that they're a one-off, large-scale investors need to know that there will be a next round. They need to expect that who will be the buyer of this? How does it become the new normal? And so that's where we see we need the combination of push and pull policy, where push can push some cash into a market and make something lower cost for the first few rounds of it. And the pull is what's the market signal that keeps it going, that ensures that there's always a buyer, if you like, a customer for whether it's this case mangrove restoration or carbon plantations or zero emissions cars and trucks and zero emissions electricity and zero emissions industrial facilities. So that's where the pull signal is why people often ask for policy that sits alongside a target. Is that what shows the early stage investors that the people who want to back them and put in that risk can see that it's what will be around in the long term. And obviously for the safety of the climate, it needs to become the new normal for the long term and happening in the near term. So the combination of push and pull, right. Seeing an early stage grant round like this, partnered with a long-term signal, such as what other countries are doing, of setting percentages that rise over time of how much of this activity needs to occur by certain times. And then that drives market activity to serve that target or that regulated demand.
Anna Skarbek, thank you so much for joining us on The Drama this evening. Thank you. Anna Skarbek, she's the Executive Director of Climate Works Australia. Now, while many observers have hailed Joe Biden's climate summit a success, it wasn't without its hiccups. Participants were stuck on mute, there was dodgy sound, and a pre-recorded segment by Emmanuel Macron continued to play, even while other leaders were speaking. And it's some comfort to know that sometimes even the most powerful people in the world can't get their tech right.
Welcome to this historic Leaders Summit on climate.
Emmanuel Macron, Monsieur le Président.
Mesdames et messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement.
Thank you.
Mesdames et messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Président des États-Unis, cher Joe Biden.
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm not sure we're hearing you here. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I now turn the floor to the President of the Russian Federation, His Excellency Vladimir Putin.
Avec le Green Deal pour lui donner. À nous donc maintenant.
We have talked about the scarcity of water. We have talked about the need to build resilience.
The floor is now to the President of the Russian Federation, Mr. Vladimir Putin. Mr. President.
And the president is just getting started as we work to tackle this crisis while creating clean energy jobs across our nation.
That is vaguely reassuring. The only thing that would have been better would have been if someone had a cat over their face that they couldn't change, or a potato.
I am not a cat.
I am not a cat. All right, and in other breaking news now, Perth is entering a snap 3-day lockdown after a returned traveller tested positive after leaving hotel quarantine. Now, the man flew in from Shanghai, did the mandatory 14 days and came out last Saturday. He then spent 5 days in Perth before flying to Melbourne. Authorities say he was contagious in this time and a close contact has already tested positive for COVID.
We've gone more than 12 months of no community transmission, and our lives in Western Australia have been normal compared to what we have seen around the world. We need to do everything we can to protect our way of life. That's why from midnight tonight, Perth and Peel will enter a 3-day lockdown over the long weekend until midnight on Monday night. I know this is hard to take, and I wish we didn't need to be doing this. But we can't take any chances with the virus. We just can't.
The man who was initially infected is now in self-isolation in Victoria, and authorities there are contact tracing passengers on the flight he came in on. Now, John, you lived through the longest lockdown in Australian history in Melbourne there. It's very concerning what's happening in Perth. At the same time, there are 2 cases that we know of. Is this the right thing? Do we need to learn to live with COVID? How do you view this as a Melburnian?
Yeah, look, I respect that there'll be different opinions on the panel and amongst our viewers, I'm absolutely sure. For my part, I know other Victorians share this view that whilst some lockdowns were necessary, they went far beyond what was reasonable and have left us dealing with a lot of the aftermath. I just hope Perth and the Western Australian government and Western Australians, generally, just learn from what happened in Victoria, where you can walk through the CBD today and it's still struggling to come back to life. So I get that at times the health advice will counsel lockdowns, but when you've got such small numbers of cases, the experience down here suggests that the magnitude of the damage you do when you shut down the entire state is so enormous. I do suspect that it's well out of proportion. It's not to downplay or dismiss the significance of the health advice, but there's more to the questions that governments have to decide and answer than just the health advice, and proportionality is important to that as well.
So to interpret what you're saying, John, are you saying you'd rather have a few people die than businesses shut?
I don't know that that's necessarily a reasonable or fair question. I think you be guided by the health advice, but if you look at Victoria, the Victorian government's decision on managing the lockdowns, which were extensive, 3 months worth at very severe levels, there were often occasions where the government even itself freely admitted that it was making decisions that wasn't supported.
Do you know what I reckon Perth people are thinking right now is, wouldn't it be great if we were all vaccinated? Wouldn't that make a difference to the situation right
and this is when it really comes back to bite, you know, the slow rollout of the vaccinations.
Interminably slow rollout.
Have you been speaking to your friends overseas who are like all vaccinated
now?
now?
They've all got it.
They've all got it.
I'm going to the US because I have to return for my green card, and I can go to the pharmacy and get the shot when I get there.
Yeah, I spoke to my friends this morning and they were all fresh from the pharmacy as well. So here we are. But while we're on the subject of COVID, India's health services are being pushed to the limit as COVID-19 cases continue to surge. Yesterday, the country recorded the single highest number of daily infections since the pandemic began, with 315,000 positive cases. People have taken to Twitter to plead for oxygen, plasma and hospital beds, with one company even offering to set up ICU care in private homes. The nation is midway through a 6-day lockdown amid growing concern about a so-called double mutant strain of the virus. Yesterday, Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced that he would restrict inbound flights from India in a bid to stop the variant from emerging here. Dr Rajiv Dasgupta is chair of the Centre of Social Medicine and Community Health at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And a warning, you may find some of these images disturbing.
Hospitals and hospital systems are finding it extremely difficult to cope, that the demand for hospital care has outstripped the supply of beds and certainly the supply of oxygen in some hospitals. So there are apps and websites that provide you nearly real-time availability of beds, both beds without oxygen supply as well as beds with oxygen and intensive care units. But the challenge is that the availability far outstrips the supply. It's equally true that there's a pressure on cremation and burial services, as the media reports portray. In this phase, in fact, a whole lot of pediatric infections have been reported, upwards of 80,000. The younger population is increasingly occupying or requiring hospitalization and therefore occupying a much higher proportion of hospital beds. And that's what has actually led to the surge in demand for clinical care, in contrast to the earlier phase, where the young adults were largely in the asymptomatic band of infections. It is possible that when the administration reviews the state of progress, the lockdown may need to be extended. However, different states have taken different views on whether or not to impose lockdown. In fact, states and the courts have also taken contrarian views on this debate of lives versus livelihoods. And it is a difficult call for state governments to take.
Scott Morrison has had a busy 24 hours defending Australia's climate change credentials, recalibrating the nation's vaccine rollout and capping arrivals from high-risk countries. And in between all of that, he's been asked what his government is doing on a crisis that's been engulfing this country for decades, after 2 more shocking cases of domestic violence this week alone.
The events that lead to this is hard to understand, and how people can take these such violent and appalling acts, but it is something our society has been sadly living with for too long, and so we will continue to do all we can to try and prevent it. And I think the work that is done in the community is so important to that end. And you will see more investment in the budget, and you will see more initiatives coming from that summit that is occurring in July, and that work continues.
He's referring to 2 cases this week. One in South Australia of a man, Henry Shepherdson, who jumped to his death with his 9-month-old daughter, Kobe. Police say initial investigations have revealed a history of domestic violence between Shepherdson and the baby's mother.
Look, every relationship is a complex thing, particularly when there is also domestic violence involved in a relationship. Whilst I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of this particular situation, that will certainly form part of our investigation as to what was happening in the relationship, and obviously what was done prior to this particular incident.
And earlier in the week, we heard about the tragic death of Kelly Wilkinson, who was allegedly burnt to death by her estranged partner on the Gold Coast. It's been revealed that Ms Wilkinson had gone to the police repeatedly in the lead up to her death.
Somewhere along the line, she had engaged with the system, with us, and we were unable to prevent this from occurring. But we're certainly going to make sure we look to improve and correct any parts of the system that we control that we can improve.
For more on this, we're joined in Brisbane by the CEO of Women's Legal Service Queensland, Angela Lynch. Angela, we're so pleased to have you on the drum this evening. I know you've been working in this area for decades and bring much expertise. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, when you see cases like Kelly Wilkinson and you hear the police saying, yes, this was a failure, yes, we need to fix it, what do you think? Where did the failure occur?
Well, I'm pretty sick of hearing police admit their failures. This is the second domestic violence incident. Obviously, these matters of Kelly Wilkinson are still before the court.
Yep.
But there was a murder-suicide of Doreen Langham earlier this year in Brisbane, also burnt to death. And the police admitted there were serious issues in relation to how the police responded. In the matter of Kelly Wilkinson, the police have again come out and said they admitted they have failed and have set up, on both instances, have set up an internal review. Well, we are sick of internal reviews. That is just not good enough. We need an independent review into the Queensland Police Service's response in relation to those 2 matters, and also in relation to, more broadly, domestic violence responses.
Did you ever find out what those internal reviews discovered? I mean, I know they were probably internal, as we've said, but was there any discussion about their findings?
That's the issue, Julia. We never find out.
Yeah.
Their internal reviews The findings aren't made public. There's no level of public accountability or any level of accountability for the community. And in some ways, I do wonder if it is also a strategy. It gets it out of the media cycle.
Yep.
The media moves on, and the questions aren't asked.
Yep, we've seen that cycle before. I think one of the questions here, you've mentioned some other women. We also know that the Gold Coast is a place where women are particularly vulnerable, where a disproportionate number of women experience violence and domestic abuse. Now, I understand that nearly a quarter of Queensland domestic and family violence orders were recorded in the Gold Coast in recent years, even though it's only got about 10% of the state's population. The city's also recorded the highest number of strangulation charges in Queensland. What's going on, do you think?
Well, there's a particular, issues down at the Gold Coast. There's a lot of social dislocation. There's a lot of drug use. There's a lot of crime and major crime, actually. And that I think that the Gold Coast is also seen as a bit of a Disneyland. So perpetrators of violence will actually specifically take women to the Gold Coast and say our lives will be better there, obviously then cutting them off from friends and family. So these are all, we don't actually know, but these are the things that services talk about down there. There's not a lot of social infrastructure compared to the population, but perhaps that sort of large mix of different kind of social things that are going on. There's also a specialist domestic violence court down there. That could also mean that people, if they've got a choice of court, they may well go to the specialist court, so that could bump numbers up. But it has, even before the specialist court existed, it has been had an extraordinarily long history of very severe domestic violence down there.
Right, which I'm sure puts the local services under a great deal of pressure. Now, if there were to be an independent inquiry into policing or handling of domestic violence in the state, you would be one of the foremost experts, I would imagine, called to speak before it. Not that, if we leave these two cases aside, just generally what you've witnessed over decades into where the shortcomings in the system are. And what would you say?
Well, I'd say that there are also good police as well, and we know that. So I want to acknowledge that.
Yep.
And by doing this independent review, it actually supports the good work that is going on. However, what we do know is that our clients tell us on a daily basis that their issues of domestic violence are dismissed at the front counter of policing stations. Their fears in relation to violence are dismissed or discounted. And exactly what Kelly's parents spoke about and her family spoke about, it's a consistent, there's a consistency there in relation to what women speak about, that, yeah, they were dismissed, they were spoken of as being crazy, action wasn't taken, and they were told to go to other services. It really was, they're a bit of a problem coming in and complaining about being in fear of their life.
I just want to open it up to the rest of the panel now, Angela, to have a discussion around this. Tory, what do you think is the impact of these kinds of stories? We do see cycles. We see politicians lament, say we must do something about it. Then they just wait to the next one that goes on. But there's also another message going out to women, isn't there, as well, about whether a system will support them?
Well, this is one of the really sort of terrifying aspects of this. I mean, I always think about women. It's so hard for women to leave abusive relationships for so many reasons. You're leaving their house, they might not have a separate source of income, and often they have absolutely nowhere to go, which is particularly difficult if they have children with them. So it's very hard to leave. And then I worry about them seeing these stories just again and again, just cropping up with this kind of tragic regularity. And then dropping off again. But what would stick in their minds, I imagine, is, well, if I leave, I'm not safe, because these women just keep falling between the cracks. I mean, the police keep saying we'll investigate this one, and then we don't find out what happens. But then it happens again. And actually some news broke this afternoon about the Shepherdson case, which was that he had been in prison for threatening to kill his child, and then the charges were dropped. Now, we don't know what happened there, but it just seems in every case, somehow men get through, and men get through to the women, and to the children. And I'm really horrified by how much harder that might make it for women to leave those relationships.
Courtney, what do you see as being at the heart of the problem here?
Men. I think it's our society's gendered roles and expectations. I think it's the fact that the people predominantly in these institutions are men. And I think that there's not, I mean, I can a hypothetical situation, like I can picture a woman going into a police station to talk to a male officer about a situation, and it does, from interactions with men in society, you can see how easily it can be dismissed. There's just such an issue, there's such a misogyny in our society, and it's underlying. I mean, it's also obviously very explicit, but it's the underlying issue. I know I was raised in a world that taught me to be misogynistic, and I've had to unpack those micro sort of ideas and things that are just fed into society. Look at leadership in this country. Look at, television. Look at all of the inputs that young people have, and they just consistently tell people that men are superior to women, which is not true. And it's this idea of male dominance that continues to lead to domestic violence and other such issues.
Yumi, I'm interested in your view, and also the fact that the Assistant Police Commissioner who we heard before, Brian Codd, said there's a cultural issue we all have to own. Often we'll speak about issues to do with domestic violence in hushed tones, as if they're taboo subjects. Yeah. Right? Even the idea of a domestic, though I thought that was changing.
No, I would love it if we all agreed to call it something different. When that poor kid was punched in King's Cross a couple of years ago, a lot of people decided and all agreed to start calling it a coward's punch instead of a king hit, because king hit was all macho and kind of glamorous, but a coward's punch was a better way of putting it, and everyone got on board. So maybe it's time to reframe
intimate
the way,
terrorism.
Yeah, and it is terrorism.
Yeah.
When this happened and when it's all over the news and you see the face of that baby Kobe, the women of Australia, there's a primal howl from us all, because we know the fear that poor mum felt, that the baby must have felt. It's so horrific, and yet we are facing it every couple of months, a horrendous story like that. And Tory's right. When Hannah Clark lost her family to her partner in Queensland last year with that burning incident in the car and with her ex, a lot of people felt terror because the violent men in Australia had been shown another way that they could hurt women. It was like, here's a new thing that you might not have thought of. So if you don't have access to a firearm, great, we're going to do this. And it scared us all. It scared us all. And what we would love to see is people taking it seriously because they know how it feels, which is going to happen when more women are in charge. When more women are making the laws and deciding to defund domestic violence charities and women's shelters, which, by the way, will never happen. So when women are making the decisions around our own safety and the safety of our children and our communities, things will be fairer. But the thing that really makes my mind explode is that we are also simultaneously being shown that we are not safe in the corridors of power to make those decisions, because if you go to Parliament House, you might get raped. And not only might you get raped, but people around you with more power will collude to cover it up.
And that leaves us where?
In that primal scream of pain and rage. We're all so angry and so fed up. There's a lot of talk in the circles that I'm in of a national women's strike, where in whatever capacity we can, we just down tools and stop working.
Like in Iceland in 1975.
That's right.
And it worked. Although I think the men called it the long day or something, the longest day ever. They were like, they all had to go, they all rushed to the butchers. I was reading about it this morning and bought to get sausages because that was the only thing they knew how to cook. They were taking them off to school with like crayons, and the women were like, I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm out. And they all took to the streets, and it was huge. And things changed when that happened. John Pesutto, I know that you've wrestled with this on a justice level. You've been a shadow Attorney General, but you've also got views about what needs to change culturally. Where do we target our efforts here?
Yeah, look, like a lot of, very difficult and challenging areas of reform in the justice space, there's short-term or immediate objectives you've got to meet and some longer-term ones. Just very quickly on the short-term objectives, sadly and tragically in so many of these cases, perhaps not all, but in most, the perpetrators, almost always men, have passed through the turnstiles of the justice system. And whether it's police not following up on bail, courts not taking repeated breaches of apprehended violence orders, which are there to stop men having, the perpetrators having contact with either their partners or their children, are not followed up on or not taken seriously enough. And that's an immediate objective because they will often culminate in acts of violence. And if you can take action on those, whether it's police following up, courts taking serious action, you can at least save lives in the short term. But of course, it's not just the short term reforms that we have to implement quickly to save lives. It is, as you say, the cultural changes, and they're going to take a bit longer, sadly. And the place of violence in our society, we still in many areas of life still value the displays of physical dominance, which play into a lot of these themes, sadly. So we have to do a lot more, and that's well beyond the justice portfolio. That's every portfolio. That's governments, federal and state. That's households, families, friends, neighbours, all coming together to change that culture. And it's happening, but it's happening all too slowly.
Angela, I can see you nodding there firmly when John was talking about the fact that so many people pass through the system, and that's obviously where a lot of the failures are. And I'm sure that you are also of the view that cultural things need to change. Would you support a women's strike?
Oh, well, that sounds pretty good, actually.
A day off.
It doesn't sound too bad, yeah. But I have to agree, in the Wilkinson case there was, and what we've called for is immediate change in relation to the Bail Act in Queensland, because the family advised, and it is in the public forum, that he was up on very serious charges and got police bail, really in circumstances, that's how he was back out in the community, really in circumstances where that should not have happened. There should have been some court oversight. So, real concerns. And really the whole legal system prioritises the rights of perpetrators over victim and children's safety, and that's right through our state courts up to the federal family court as well.
Now, Angela, when these stories come up, we hear them, most people just hear them periodically when they land in the news, and we grieve and we puzzle and we wonder what to do and we ask for some kind of change. But I know that you, every single day, are dealing with this and are helping people and are trying to kind of give comfort or give protection to people who are vulnerable, who are, have been suffering violence. So thank you for taking time out of your day to come and talk to us about your work.
And thanks, Julia, and thanks for all the work that you do here and outside in the media in relation to promoting these issues. We on the ground appreciate that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. You take care. Angela Lynch is the CEO of the Women's Legal Service Queensland. Now, another question that we've been asking on this program in recent weeks and months, and that is, what is consent? It's a question that's been front and centre since former Sydney school student Chanel Contos launched an online petition calling for better sexual education in schools. Over 2,000 current and former students responded with stories of rape, assault and harassment, all with the common theme: consent was absent, not sought or not understood. Now, Contos's hope is that better and earlier education about consent will prevent people from being sexually assaulted in high school, assaults which she and thousands of other people have experienced. Principals, educators, advocates and government have joined in the conversation, pledging their commitment. So what has changed? The Drum's Bethan Smolenick finds out.
The need for better consent education in schools saw the government launch a new online resource for staff and students. The Good Society website contains more than 350 videos and teaching materials. to help kids understand sex, consent, and respectful relationships.
To cross into the action zone, both people must agree.
Do you want to try my milkshake?
Yes, I do.
Is it better than yours?
You know, I think I prefer mine.
But what happens when one person takes action without an agreement?
You do, huh? Well, drink it.
This video in particular outraged advocates.
This video is so problematic in so many ways. I think it's just insulting to the intelligence of everyone, you know, not just adults, to children as well.
Well, it's confusing. I mean, I know what consent is, and I was genuinely confused watching it.
This is yet another example of where people are more concerned about upsetting those who find it uncomfortable to have real conversations than they're concerned about the people who will suffer serious consequences if we don't have those real conversations.
This video, along with one other, has since been removed. The Department of Education says it made the decision after community and stakeholder feedback.
The department will continue to engage with experts to evaluate the materials that appear on the website to ensure they are fit for purpose and reflect current experiences and community issues.
So, how do we teach school children about consent, and what sort of resources should we use? A new book called Welcome to Consent by Yumi Stynes and Dr. Melissa Kang is hoping to provide some answers. It's designed for tweens and teens and explores what consent is with relatable and age-appropriate content.
Consent means an agreement between people that they want to do something. We tend to think that consent happens when people want to touch or get close or physically intimate with someone. But even when you're not doing those things, you still need to know about consent.
The guide merges personal stories and facts about concepts like consent and coercion. It helps young people have the awkward conversations about puberty, horniness, and setting boundaries. But most importantly, it empowers young people to have the confidence to say no.
Sometimes no is even more beautiful than yes, even though we tend to think we should always be aiming to hear a yes answer. No, or non-consent, is beautiful because it means the person communicating that has successfully shown you where their boundaries are.
Yumi, I cannot believe the timing of this book. You've been working on it for 2 years,
Yep.
and it could not be better times in this massive discussion we're having. Tell us what you want kids to know or be able to do that they might not be able to now.
Well, consent's not about just saying no. It's sort of about tapping into yourself and going, well, what do I actually want? And at that sort of adolescent time, it's very confusing because you're kind of exploring your own feelings and you're having feelings that you've never had before. So there's a lot that's sending conflicting signals and you have to really check in with yourself to know which one to listen to. Having really clear, set out, explained resources helps kids to set a framework for their morals, for their ethical choice, and then they can navigate through based on those anchors. It's kind of like knowing this is what mum would like. You don't necessarily do what she wants, but it's good to know where she stands so that you can make a choice based on that.
Yeah, although we probably wouldn't bring mum in when we were talking about consent.
Well, I actually think we would, and we should.
You would?
Yeah, we should always bring mum in and dad and keep the conversations going around consent.
So tell us why you think it's a beautiful thing. I mean, you were speaking about that in that grab we had then. So many people describe it as a break on desire and as kind of an awkward thing to do. Tell us why you see it as the opposite.
Well, you're absolutely right, and a lot of research has shown it. When people say, you know, what do you have a conversation like? What do you like sexually? Like, what really turns you on? People are terrified to have that conversation because they think it's going to be like everything will explode. My brain will explode, my tits will explode, and the sex thing will be off, right? So, but that's actually not true. If somebody says to you what really, you know, excites you, well, you have a chance to answer and they'll know. So the consent conversation is actually really great. It can be warm and humorous and it can really help set up a great experience between you and another person. Most of all, it shows you that it shows them that you're humanising them, that they have needs and wants that are unique to them and that you care about what they are. And if that need and want is for you to get your hands off me, that's okay, because they've communicated that, you've understood and you've listened.
And you put out a video as well on Instagram, Courtney, which I loved. Tell me about the response you had to that. But you also made the point that it's sexy.
Yeah, I think consent is sexy. And my video also cost a lot less than the $3.8 million I spent on the milkshake one.
Right.
But I think consent is sexy. And I've had intimate experiences. And for a man to show interest in your feelings and your desires is sexy. Right. I do remember in the beginning thinking like, oh, that's awkward, isn't it? Like asking for, like, oh, is it? But actually when you do it and it becomes normalised and usual, it's actually a really beautiful thing, like Yumi was saying. And I think there's so much shame and stigma around sex, and it becomes this sort of like hidden conversation, and kids in school are talking about it like this, and we're using euphemisms like milkshakes and tacos. Like, it's no wonder that we can't just talk about this and deal with our real human emotions. And when it gets repressed like that, then consent becomes an issue because you're dealing with a taboo. And so in order for consent to make sense, you have to be able to talk about sex.
But we're just not used to articulating desires, especially women.
That's so true, and we're not taught to be in touch with our bodies. What we found in some of the research that we did is that connecting shame or maybe something a bit naughty with consent means that often people will keep secrets, and that can be really dangerous. So being frank and open with your children, for instance, is really useful. Reflecting on my own experiences, my parents just didn't want me to drink at all. So it was prohibitionist. So I couldn't say, listen, I drank so much that I spewed last night. Can we talk about that? It'd be like, you don't drink.
Right.
And so there was no discussion. There was no, let's maybe talk this through because you're obviously doing it wrong. And the same with sex. A lot of parents are a bit icky about their kids having sex and want to be in complete denial about it. So the kids can't have these conversations.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I just was going to...
I saw you go.
I did, right? I was just thinking about my conversations with my teenage daughter at that particular point. And what has the reaction to this been?
Oh, it's been incredible.
Yeah.
So I've got a lot of hopes for the book. It's not out till next month, May 19. What I would love, and my fantasy...
It's a drum exclusive, we call it.
Yeah, that's you're very special to have a copy right now.
Okay, good.
I just have a fantasy that'll be given to every school kid, you know, maybe year 6, 7 or 8, will get a copy, and it's so snackable that it's actually readable. You know, it's not like a book that you want a best intention kind of situation. I would love it if sports clubs with those rapey...
She's got dreams of widespread dissemination. And if you just a reminder, if you've been affected by anything we're discussing, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1-800-RESPECT. I want to thank our magnificent panel. We had so much to talk about. Yumi Stynes, Courtney Act, Pesutto, Tory Shepherd. Have a great weekend.
Hello. Right after the news, it's garden